Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown, and she begged Father Brown silently, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. She spoke without saying anything. They found her kneeling at the altar with blood on her hands and a smile that didn't belong to the living. Father Brown had seen many strange things in the sleepy English villages that dotted the countryside like forgotten secrets, but never before had he seen a girl confess with her eyes while her lips remained frozen in silence. Her name was Clara, just Clara. She wouldn't give a surname, nor a family home, only that she had come to the church because she needed to be near God. And yet, when they questioned her about the body in the choir loft, about the blood that dripped like wax from her fingertips, she said nothing, not a single word, but her expression said everything and nothing all at once. It was Inspector Maddox who called it in. "You'll want to see this, Father," he'd said, his voice shaken, though he tried to hide it behind his usual scowl. "She's either mad or something much worse." The chapel was dark, with rain, misting against the stained glass windows, casting blurred halos around the saints as if heaven itself had gone blind. Clara hadn't moved from her kneeling position in hours. The blood had dried on her palms. Still, she smiled. Still, she stared at the cross like it knew her sins, but refused to speak them aloud. The body in the loft belonged to Miss Evelyn Hart, the choir mistress, strict, devout, unmarried. She was found lying face up, arms arranged like a crucifix, mouth open mid-hymn. Her eyes had been closed manually, gently. No sign of struggle, no scream, no force. The only unnatural thing was the small scrap of velvet ribbon clutched in her right hand, torn as if yanked during a fall, a ribbon that matched the one in Clara's hair. But Clara insisted she never touched Evelyn. She never said it, of course. She didn't speak at all. But she wrote it, neat cursive, on the back of an old hymn sheet. She plucked from the pew. "I didn't touch her. She just stopped." And beneath those words, a second line, fainter, added later, "They told me not to sing." Father Brown watched her closely. Not for guilt, for meaning. He had learned long ago that evil didn't always announce itself with violence or vanity. Sometimes it sat quietly in a pew, folding its hands like a good girl. Sometimes it smiled when it should have screamed. The mystery wasn't just who killed Evelyn Hart. It was who, or what, Clara was. She was no local. No one in Kembleford recognized her, not even Mrs. Green at the grocer's, who made it her business to know every face within a 15-mile radius. No fingerprints, no belongings, no luggage in the church guest room she had been offered the night before. She had come from nowhere and left nothing behind but her silence and her smile. When Father Brown tried to speak with her alone, she simply stared at the wooden crucifix above the altar and mouthed a word. Just one, not spoken, but shaped with her lips so carefully he couldn't be sure if he'd truly seen it or imagined it. "Forgive." But what sin? Maddox wanted to charge her. He had no motive, no weapon, but the scene was too neat, too strange, too perfect to be a coincidence. "There's something off about her," he muttered. "She walked right into the chapel after midnight. Choir practice ended hours before. The vicar's wife said she heard humming, then a scream, then silence. And when we came in, there she was, still as death." But Father Brown shook his head. "Sometimes stillness speaks louder than blood, Inspector." That night, while the village buzzed with rumors, Father Brown returned to the chapel alone. Rain tapped against the windows like a warning. He lit a candle and studied the hymn sheet again, the one Clara had written on. Something about the way she formed her letters. It wasn't childish, though she looked young. It wasn't rushed. It was meticulous, precise, like someone trained to write beautifully, but not freely. He turned the sheet over and saw faint impressions from previous writing. He held it up to the light and read the ghost of a sentence. "If I sing again, she dies." It wasn't Clara's handwriting, so who wrote it? The next morning, Clara was gone, vanished from the guest room, no trace, no footprints. The back door of the chapel was found unlocked, though it had been bolted from the inside. No one saw her leave, but there was something else in the chapel now. On the altar, a small silver locket opened, with a faded photograph inside. Evelyn Hart, 20 years younger, arm in arm with another girl. A girl who looked exactly like Clara. Father Brown felt a coldness rise in his chest. He recognized the background in the photo. It was from the old St. Agnes orphanage, burned down a decade ago. The place had housed dozens of girls, but the records were sealed after the fire. All but one. One girl was listed as missing, presumed dead, name Clarice Haven. Clara. Just Clara. So, was she Evelyn's sister, her ward, her secret, or something else? He didn't have answers, only more silence. The locket offered no date, no initials, but inside the clasp, etched so faintly it could have been mistaken for a scratch, were the words, "The voice must stay buried." Maddox was furious. "We had her right there, Brown. Now she's vanished into thin air, and we've got a dead choir mistress and a village terrified of ghosts." Father Brown said nothing for a long while. Then, "She's not a ghost, Inspector, but someone wants her to be." Later that afternoon, a boy from the church choir found something wedged beneath the organ bench, a strip of tape, the kind used to mute piano keys, and beneath it, a note, scrawled in haste. "I only sang once. She heard me." Then it started again. Started what? The next Sunday, during Mass, someone attempted to break into the church's cellar. They failed, but when the constable arrived to investigate, they found something curious in the locked cellar room. Dozens of discarded hymn sheets, all marked with the same verse circled in red pencil. "Sing unto the Lord a new song. Let everything that hath breath." Father Brown stood in the doorway, staring at the pile. They weren't hiding her. They were hiding her voice. That evening, he visited the old grounds of the St. Agnes orphanage. Nothing remained but bricks and weeds. But in the center of the ruins, he found a stone plaque, weather-worn, cracked down the middle. He cleaned the moss from it carefully. It read, "For the girl whose voice could not be silenced." That night, the chapel bell rang 3 times. No one pulled the rope. Clara's ribbon appeared again, tied around the crucifix. No one saw her. No one heard her. But Father Brown, alone in the pew, whispered a question to the darkness. "What did you sing, child?" And in the hollow silence that followed, he heard it, not with his ears, with something deeper. A voice that wasn't spoken, a cry that wasn't made, a truth, too, dangerous to say out loud. He closed his eyes, and crossed himself. "I know who did it," he whispered, "but the truth will never be told." The candle on the altar blew out by itself, and the chapel fell quiet again. Too quiet, as if breath itself had been exiled from its walls. The mystery had only just begun. Chapter 2. Father Brown watched her lie. She swore she hadn't seen the body, but her shoes were still wet with the dead man's blood. The girl stood in the drawing room like a portrait that had been touched up to hide a scream. Her name was Lavinia Fairfax, and if you asked the village gossips, she was the sort of girl who could charm the marrow from a man's bones and still have him thanking her for the privilege. But Father Brown, standing quietly in the corner with his hat tucked respectfully in his hands, wasn't watching her smile. He was watching her lie, not lie in words. Those she wielded with expert control. Her voice was honey, just thick enough to hide the rot. But it was in the tilt of her wrist, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the teacup too tightly, the twitch of her left eyelid every time Inspector Maddox asked a question she didn't want to answer. Those were the lies Father Brown listened for, not the ones spoken aloud, the ones whispered by the body. The victim was Edmund Blake, heir to a fortune made in rubber and lost in women. They found him face down in the reflecting pool at the edge of the Fairfax estate, limbs sprawled like a marionette whose strings had been cut. No wounds, no bruising, just water in the lungs and the faint scent of lavender soap on his collar. The exact scent Lavinia had been wearing at the vicar's picnic 2 days before. "I was reading in my room," Lavinia said sweetly, with the door locked. "Cook can tell you. She brought me my supper at precisely 7:30. Cook confirmed it. So did the maid. But the rain had come hard that night, and the garden paths had turned to slick black mud, and the soles of Lavinia's patent leather shoes bore the unmistakable kiss of it. Father Brown saw it when she crossed her legs. Just a glimpse, a smear of dirt and something else, something darker. The problem, Maddox argued later, was that everyone had a reason to want Edmund Blake dead. The vicar's wife had caught him fondling the church funds. The blacksmith's son claimed he'd taken liberties with his sister. And Lavinia was engaged to him, or so the village thought. But no engagement had ever been announced. No ring had ever been seen. Only a letter in Edmund's pocket, now soggy and wrinkled, in a woman's careful script. "If you say a word, I will drown you in your own sins." No signature. But Father Brown had seen the ink before. The same fountain pen Lavinia had used to sign the donation book for the children's charity, a detail no one else would notice. But Father Brown noticed everything. He stayed behind after the others left, sat in the drawing room facing Lavinia as she pretended to be too weak to sit up straight. She offered tea. He declined. She offered sympathy. He declined that too. What he did offer, quietly and without judgment, was a question. "What did he threaten to say, Miss Fairfax?" Her eyes widened, but only for a breath. Then the smile returned, practiced, polished. "I haven't the faintest idea what you mean, Father." But her left hand clutched the armrest, knuckles white. Father Brown noted it, noted everything. Outside, the rain resumed, gentle but insistent, like time tapping its fingers against the glass. "He was cruel," Lavinia said at last, her voice distant. "But you know that already, don't you? You heard the stories. Everyone heard the stories. But no one stopped him." "And did you?" Father Brown asked softly. She turned her head sharply, but he didn't flinch. "I told him I wouldn't let him ruin me, that I'd rather die. But he did die." "Yes," she said, almost too quickly. And that was the moment Father Brown knew. He watched the way her pupils dilated. Not in fear, in calculation. Lavinia Fairfax had rehearsed this. Every sentence, every breath, every tremble of the chin. But she hadn't rehearsed what came next. Father Brown reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. He placed it gently on the table between them. She stared at it, the color draining from her face. It was a cufflink, gold, engraved with the initials E.B. "We found it in the upstairs bathtub," he said. "Not the pond." She began, then stopped. Her lips parted. Her mouth hung there, suspended like a puppet string had been clipped. "You scrubbed it," he continued, "but the blood had already pooled in the drain. And you forgot the cufflink. Everyone forgets one thing." Lavinia's fingers moved slowly toward the object, then stopped just short of touching it. She looked at Father Brown, something crumbling behind her eyes. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "He wasn't supposed to fight back." There it was, the first truth. But it wasn't the last. Maddox returned within the hour, ready to make an arrest. But Father Brown held up a hand. "Not yet," he said. "There's more." Lavinia was taken into custody, but she didn't speak again. Not for days. Not until the second body surfaced. It was the maid, Clara, from the chapel. Her corpse was found behind the greenhouse, buried beneath a bed of rotting roses. Her throat had been cut, clean, surgical. The kind of cut that didn't come from panic, but planning. And in her hand, pressed tightly, as though even in death she was trying to keep it secret, was a photograph. It showed Edmund Blake and Lavinia Fairfax, arm in arm, smiling. But in the background, barely visible, stood Clara, her face blurred, her expression blank. But her shadow looked like it, was screaming. Maddox was baffled. "I thought this was about jealousy, rejection. Lavinia killed Edmund because he jilted her. But what's the maid got to do with it?" Father Brown said nothing. He turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in rushed ink, "She made me lie. She said if I didn't, she'd do to me what she did to him." Suddenly, Lavinia's silence made sense. She hadn't confessed because she thought it would protect her. But now, the story had shifted. She wasn't just a woman scorned. She was something much colder. She was a composer. And Clara was just the first note in a melody written in blood. Still, Father Brown wasn't satisfied. Something about it all. It was too clean, too arranged, as if Lavinia wanted to be caught. And that's when he found the journal. Not Lavinia's, Edmund's, hidden in a compartment of his writing desk. Its pages water-damaged, but legible. The final entry was dated the night he died. "She says she loves me, but she lied once, and I think she'll lie again. She told me about the girl in Brighton, the one that vanished. She said, if I ever left her, she'd make me disappear too. I thought it was just a threat, but now I'm not sure." A girl in Brighton? There were no reports of a missing woman there. Not under Lavinia's name, but then again, maybe she hadn't used her real name. Father Brown went to Brighton. He didn't expect to find much, but in the archives of the local church, he found a funeral record. Jane Holloway, age 23, drowned in a boating accident. Closed casket. The priest remembered it. Sad case. The man she was with vanished. Left the country, maybe. But there was something strange about her mother. Wouldn't speak to anyone. Said the girl wasn't her daughter. Said her real daughter had died years earlier, and there it was. Lavinia Fairfax wasn't Lavinia Fairfax at all. She had taken a name, a life, a history, layer by layer, like clothing put on over a corpse. When Father Brown returned to the village, Lavinia was gone. She had escaped custody, disappeared in the night. Her cell was locked, no signs of forced exit, just an open window and a single sheet of paper left behind on her cot. On it, one sentence. "I told one lie, Father." The rest they believed on their own. Maddox was furious. Again. But Father Brown only nodded, quietly folding the paper and placing it in his pocket. "She'll do it again," Maddox said. "Wherever she is. She's a monster." "No," Father Brown replied. "She's worse than that." Didn't explain what he meant, but later, alone in the chapel, he lit a candle and whispered to no one in particular, "I know who she is. But the truth will never be told." And somewhere, far from Kembleford, a new woman introduced herself with a name that wasn't hers, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Chapter 3. The silence screamed her guilt. She didn't cry when they found the body. She just looked at it like she'd already buried him in her mind. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday. A funeral, yes, but quiet, dignified. Miss Cora Bellamy, the grieving widow in lace gloves and a veil so thick it nearly swallowed her face, stood beside the coffin with the stillness of stone. The villagers whispered that she hadn't shed a single tear for her husband, Leonard Bellamy, whose body now lay cold inside the church. But it wasn't her lack of tears that chilled Father Brown. It was the stillness, the total absence of sound around her. Not a sob, not a tremble, not a word, just the silence. And silence, he knew, was sometimes the loudest confession of all. Leonard's death had been ruled an accident. A heart attack on the stairwell, they said. A man of his age, of his appetites, it wasn't unthinkable. He drank too much, laughed too hard, argued too loud. But he wasn't hated, not publicly. He ran the mill, paid his workers, gave coins to the poor. He was large, brash, alive, until he wasn't. But Cora, young, pale, quiet Cora, hadn't called the doctor, hadn't screamed when she found him collapsed at the bottom of the stairs. She had waited 2 hours, then calmly informed the constable that her husband was dead. Not dying, not hurt, not please help, just dead. Father Brown watched her during the service. Others bowed their heads. She stared straight ahead, unblinking, unmoved, as if she were watching a play she'd already seen too many times. And that's what troubled him. Not grief, but preparation. After the service, the villagers gathered in whispers. Cora walked slowly back to the manor, alone, ignoring the condolences as if they were raindrops on glass. Mrs. Durnley, the old baker's wife, leaned in and muttered, "She didn't even touch the coffin. Not once, like she didn't want to catch whatever he had." Maddox was there, of course, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "It's not a crime to be cold, Father," he said, "but it is odd." Odd was enough for Father Brown. He visited the Bellamy Manor the next morning under the guise of offering prayers. Cora met him at the door. No veil now, just that same silent expression, like a painting that dared you to find its meaning. She led him to the sitting room without speaking, poured tea without asking, sat without invitation. He watched her hands, smooth, steady, not the hands of a woman who had just lost the man she'd been married to for 4 years. "I came to ask about Leonard's last days," Father Brown said gently. She tilted her head. "He drank. He shouted. He gambled. Is that what you mean?" "No," Father Brown said, watching her carefully. I mean, did he say anything strange? Seem worried? Scared? Did he tell you something? In confidence? Her gaze drifted to the window. Leonard never told me anything in confidence, Father. He didn't think I was worth confiding in. There it was, the first crack. But I heard, she added, voice calm, that he had a visitor, 2 nights before he died. A man. You might ask the housemaid. I was upstairs, Father Brown did. The maid, a nervous girl named Elsie, confirmed it. A tall fellow, she whispered, wore gloves indoors. Didn't give a name. But Mr. Bellamy looked white as a sheet when he left. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel and read through the register of visitors to the village. No names stood out, no strangers reported. But something about Cora's silence clung to him. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't shock. It was knowledge. The kind of silence a person chooses when the truth is more dangerous than the lie. 3 days later, the coroner's report arrived. It hadn't been requested. Leonard's death was deemed natural. But someone somewhere had pressed for a deeper look, and the report didn't show heart failure. It showed poison. Belladonna, small traces in the stomach, enough to paralyze, enough to mimic a sudden collapse. Father Brown stared at the paper. Belladonna. The plant grew wild behind the chapel, but it also grew in the gardens of Bellamy Manor. Maddox wanted to act, but without more, without something definitive, it was still speculation. So Father Brown returned to the manor. Again Cora greeted him. Again she led him inside. But this time, she said something first. "You read it, didn't you?" she asked, folding her hands. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if that answer had been rehearsed. "Then you understand," she said. "Understand what?" She stood, moved to the fireplace, picked up a framed photograph, her and Leonard smiling stiffly on their wedding day. "I was 16 when I married him. He was 42. My mother owed him money. My dowry was the payment." She placed the photo face down on the mantel. "Do you think I'm guilty?" Father Brown didn't answer. She smiled faintly. "I didn't ask what the law thinks. I asked what you think. I think silence," he said quietly, "can be many things. A weapon, a shield, or sometimes a scream that no one wants to hear." She didn't reply, only looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes filled with something that resembled fear. That night, the housemaid vanished. Elsie, gone, her room empty, her trunk untouched. A note left behind, 4 words scribbled on the back of a laundry list. "I know too much." Maddox launched a search, but no signs, no footprints, no witnesses. Father Brown stood in Elsie's room, staring at the rumpled bed, and then he saw it. On the floor, under the dresser, a small velvet pouch. Inside it, another photograph. Not a portrait, not a wedding. A man, unknown, standing beside Leonard Bellamy in a city alley, and behind them, a third figure, Cora. But her face had been scratched out, not by time, by fingernails. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He reread the coroner's report, the visitor's description, the missing girl. And one more thing. In Leonard's study, which the constables had finally cleared for inspection, was a journal. Locked, but the key had been left dangling from the drawer. Inside, 4 entries, 3 mundane, expenses, weather, a wager, but the last one chilled the blood. "She thinks I don't know, but I do. I saw her in the garden with him, the man from Brighton. I saw the vial. She told me it was perfume, but the roses she touched died the next day. I think I'm already dead." Brighton again. The name had come up before. The woman in the photo in Chapter 2. The name in the registry that never matched. Was this man the same? Was this another identity? Another mask? Father Brown visited Brighton in silence. No records matched Cora Bellamy, but they matched a Clara Holloway, age 23, vanished 2 years ago. Foul play suspected, no body recovered. Her fiancé, unidentified, vanished the same night. Father Brown returned to Kembleford, with the realization clawing at his throat. Cora had never existed, and Leonard Bellamy had discovered her lie too late. Back at the manor, the house was dark, empty. No servants, no widow. Just a letter waiting on the altar of the chapel, addressed to Father Brown. You always saw me, Father. Not what I said, but what I didn't. Thank you for listening to the part of me that was screaming. No signature, just a pressed petal. Belladonna. Father Brown stared at it for a long time before folding the letter and placing it beside the others. Maddox stormed in minutes later. She's gone. Took the horses. Took the silver. God knows where she is now. But Father Brown only whispered to the shadows. I know who she is. And then quietly, as the candlelight flickered against the walls. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 4. She ran before he knocked. She ran before he knocked, but the door had already been unlocked from the inside. It was raining when she disappeared. Heavy, endless rain that made the village look like it was drowning in its own secrets. Her name was Annabel Graves, and she wasn't supposed to be in Kembleford at all. No one remembered seeing her arrive. No car, no bags, just a girl in a black coat standing outside the vicarage one morning like she'd been dropped from the sky. She claimed she was a distant cousin of the Melfords, though none of the Melfords had ever mentioned her. And when asked what brought her to the village, she answered with a smile too bright to trust, a little peace and quiet. That was 5 days ago. Now her room in the guest house was empty, the sheets still warm, and the only evidence she had ever existed was a cracked teacup by the window, the sound of footsteps running through wet grass, and a door that had been left swinging open, though no one had come to visit. Not officially. What made it worse, what made it impossible to ignore, was that Father Brown had intended to knock. He had walked all the way to the guest house that morning, troubled by something he couldn't name. He didn't even know what he meant to ask her, only that something in her story itched at the back of his mind like a verse he couldn't quite remember. But when he lifted his hand to knock, he didn't need to. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, she was already gone. Not missing, fled. And that was what chilled him. Because people don't run unless they know someone is coming. Maddox was convinced it was nothing. Young woman with secrets, hiding from something or someone. Probably a lover or a debt. It happens all the time. But Father Brown wasn't so sure. He asked to see her belongings. The innkeeper shrugged. She only ever carried that handbag. Said she traveled light. The handbag left behind in the room contained a single object, a brass key marked 17B, and a letter. The letter had no address, only a name. Father Brown opened it. If you find this before he does, don't tell anyone where I've gone. Please, you don't know what he did to her. No signature, no explanation. Just that. What he did to her. Who was she? That evening the rains flooded the lower lanes. Father Brown walked the roads anyway, his shoes soaked, coat heavy with water, searching for something, anything, that would explain who Annabel Graves really was. That name, something about it rang oddly in his mind. Not the surname, but the rhythm of it, like a name spoken often by someone pretending not to remember. He stopped by the post office, asked the clerk if any letters had been addressed to her. One. Arrived 3 days ago. The clerk retrieved it from under the counter. No return name. Postmarked from Brighton. Father Brown opened it carefully. Inside, a photograph. 2 girls, arms linked, smiling in the sunlight. One of them was unmistakably Annabel. The other, the second girl, was someone he recognized, not from life, but from death. It was Clara Holloway, the same Clara from Chapter 1. From the church, from the kneeling silence, from the missing locket and the hymn sheet scrawled with warnings, the one who vanished before she could explain herself. Father Brown felt the weight of it settle behind his eyes like fog thickening across a field. Annabel Graves knew Clara. They weren't strangers. They were sisters, or something like sisters. Maddox scoffed when he saw the photo. "It proves nothing," he said. "Maybe she knew the girl. Doesn't mean she had anything to do with the death. Clara disappeared months ago. Annabel didn't show up until this week." Father Brown turned the photo over. One line was written on the back in pen, so faded it was almost invisible. "Tell Father Brown, before it starts again." Starts again? That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. He couldn't sleep. The storm raged louder, tearing at the stained glass windows as though the sky itself wanted in. He sat in the pew, candle flickering at his side, and remembered something from long ago. A name, not Annabel Graves, but Anne Gray, a girl who vanished in Brighton 10 years ago, 17. No family, no record of where she went, just disappeared. Father Brown pulled the parish records, searched for the name. He found it, buried in the old newspaper clippings. Anne Gray, witness to a trial. Key witness, in fact, a murder case involving a prominent man. A man who was acquitted, because Anne Gray never showed up to testify. She had vanished the night before the hearing, and now she was back, with a new name, in a new village, running before anyone knocked. The next morning, the bakery burned down. No one was inside, no one hurt, but painted on the side wall in black soot was a single sentence, written by hand. "Tell him nothing, or burn too." The villagers panicked. Maddox declared it the work of vandals. Father Brown said nothing, but deep inside, he knew the fire wasn't a warning. It was a message. Someone had followed Annabel. Someone wanted her silent, just like Clara, just like Anne Gray, just like all the girls who knew something they shouldn't. He returned to the guest house, searched the room again, this time more thoroughly. Beneath the mattress, pressed between 2 planks, he found a small envelope. Inside, a torn piece of newspaper, a classified ad. "If you still remember, come to Kembleford. Room 4, bring nothing. Trust no one." The ad had run 2 weeks ago. In a Brighton paper, Father Brown returned to the chapel. He rang the bell once, then again, a third time, a signal, a call, and someone answered. She stepped out of the shadows in the back pews. Not Annabel, Clara. Alive, pale, thin, eyes hollow from too much running and too little rest. "I shouldn't have come back," she said, "but I didn't know where else to go." He asked her where Annabel was. "I don't know," Clara whispered. "She left before they could follow. She always ran first. Always. That's how she survived." He asked who they were. Clara didn't answer. She handed him a folded slip of paper, a list, names, dozens of them, female, all connected to one man. Father Brown read the name at the top of the list. It was a name no one in the village had spoken in years. a name buried under donations and charity and praise. A man who had once preached from the pulpit where Father Brown now stood. A man who had disappeared suddenly one winter and never returned. The Reverend Alton Pierce. He was never charged, never even accused, but whispers had followed him like smoke. And now, here was proof. Clara ran. Again. She disappeared into the woods as Maddox arrived. But she left behind the list. And Annabel? She hadn't vanished. Not exactly. Her body was found at dawn, beneath the bridge. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just cold and silent. Her mouth filled with rose petals. No one saw who placed them. No one saw who closed her eyes. But Father Brown knew, because she ran before he knocked, because she knew someone was coming, because she had tried to tell him before it started again. And now it had. Maddox asked if they should open a case, but Father Brown said nothing, only turned to the candle beside the altar and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 5. The window held her secret. She screamed loud enough to wake the manor, yet when they broke down the door, the window was wide open, and she was gone. It was supposed to be the safest room in the house, top floor, bolted from the inside, only one door, only one window. They had locked her in, for her own protection. That's what they all said. The doctor, the housekeeper, even the man she had once called fiancé. Eleanor Vane was not mad, but the village had decided otherwise after her third attempt to tell them what she saw, or claimed to. The trouble was, she kept changing the details. First, she said she witnessed a murder. Then, it was a confession whispered through the wall. Then, it was a man in the garden at midnight, digging a grave behind the greenhouse. But every time someone went to check, there was nothing. No blood, no prints, no grave. Just Eleanor, breathless and pale, pointing to a window no one else had looked through. Father Brown didn't know Eleanor well. He'd seen her in the back of the church, years ago before the incident in Brighton that no one talked about. She had once been bright, they said, musical, kind. But something broke in her after her sister died, or vanished. The stories were unclear. There was no grave, just silence. And now, Eleanor had vanished too. The only thing left behind, in the locked bedroom, was her shawl, snagged on the window latch, and on the glass, the faint outline of a palm, pressed from the inside. But not hers. It was a larger hand, male. The window was 3 stories above the ground. There were no footprints in the mud beneath, and no ladder had ever touched the wall. Maddox dismissed it as hysteria. She probably ran away before the door was bolted, hid somewhere, or fell. But there was no body, and that window told a different story. Father Brown climbed the stairs himself. The rain was beginning again, painting the glass with streaks that looked like tears. He stood at the window, just as she must have, and looked out, across the garden, beyond the chapel, toward the tree line. And there it was, a light, flickering, then gone. He didn't speak of it at first, not to Maddox, not to the housekeeper. He simply returned that night, alone, coat buttoned tight against the wind, and walked the path through the garden Eleanor had once pointed to in one of her ravings. It led nowhere, the others said, just to the old well, long sealed, long forgotten. But that night, it wasn't empty. At the edge of the stones, he found something small, a piece of ribbon, torn. Woven into the edge of it were 3 tiny letters, stitched in fading thread. V. He took it back to the manor, said nothing, and returned again in daylight. This time, he brought Maddox. The well had no ladder, but it had depth. When they lowered a torch down, it flickered in the wind, which meant air, which meant passage, and then Maddox saw it, carved into the mossy stone on the edge of the well, barely visible unless one leaned in. Too close was a message. They watch me through the glass. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He read Eleanor's journals, rescued from her room by the nervous maid. Page after page of spiraling ink, inconsistent dates, repeated words, cryptic lines, but one sentence stood out, repeated over and over, like a prayer or curse. The window is not a window. He didn't understand what it meant. Not yet, but it pulled at him. The next morning, he spoke with the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Howarth, who rarely ventured past the hedges. "I used to hear her up there," he admitted, talking to herself. Or maybe not to herself. Sometimes I thought she was arguing. Other times, laughing. "Did you ever see anyone at the window?" Father Brown asked. Howarth hesitated. "Not her." That was enough. Father Brown returned to the room. Again he stood at the window, and then for the first time he looked at it differently. He looked at the glass, not through it, and then he saw it, scratched into the bottom right corner, only visible at the right angle in daylight. A word. Help. But the scratch was on the outside of the glass, and no one had been outside that window, not unless they could fly. That night, Maddox returned with a locksmith. They removed the frame, lifted the glass. It wasn't a normal window. It was two panes fused together, and between them, pressed like a trapped butterfly, was a folded piece of paper. No one could explain how it got there, but they opened it. Drawing two girls, holding hands, smiling, one labeled E, the other labeled C, Clara. Again. Every thread pulled back to her, to the girl who never stopped vanishing, to the girl who knew too much, to the ghost everyone stopped believing in. And beneath the drawing, a final message. One of us is in the mirror. The other is in the well, the window, the well, the reflection, the silence. Maddox said it was nonsense. Madness. Father Brown didn't argue. He returned to the chapel. And there, waiting in the pew, sat a woman in a black coat. She turned slowly. It wasn't Clara. It was Eleanor. Alive. "I didn't run," she whispered. "I was taken." He asked by whom. She said nothing, only pointed to the stained glass. And there, in the colored reflection, stood two shadows. But only one of them moved. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, "but the truth will never be told." Chapter 6. He hid something in confession. He didn't whisper his sin. He buried it under the floorboards of the confessional, while Father Brown sat just inches away, listening to nothing. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary on the surface. The village moved with its usual rhythm. The butcher opened late, the grocer gossiped too much, and the chapel bells rang just before noon. But by evening, the air shifted, not with wind or weather, but with something quieter, something like dread. That morning, a man had entered St. Mary's to confess his sins. He was unremarkable to most. Mid-40s, clean hands, careful hair, a stranger to Kembleford, he said. Passing through, just wanted to leave the weight of something behind. Father Brown welcomed him gently into the wooden booth and sat back, expecting the usual. A quarrel with a wife, a lapse in judgment, a forgotten prayer. But no voice came through the screen, only breathing. Measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. And then, after 3 minutes of silence, the door creaked open. The man was gone. and Father Brown knew instantly. Something had been taken, not given. That's when he noticed the flaw. The confessional wasn't built for comfort. Worn wood, uneven planks. But beneath his feet, one of the floorboards felt looser than it had ever before, as if someone had shifted it just enough to hide something underneath. Later, when the chapel emptied, Father Brown returned. Quietly, deliberately. He pried up the board with the edge of a candle holder. Beneath it, a cloth pouch, and inside that, something colder than metal. A rosary, but not just any rosary. The beads were blackened with soot. One was chipped, another cracked, but the crucifix was unmistakable. Silver, engraved with initials, E.B., and on its backside, a single line carved deep into the metal. "Forgive me." I lied. Father Brown's hands froze, because he had seen this rosary before. It belonged to Edmund Blake, the man found dead in the choir loft 2 months ago, the man whose death had never been solved. Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, fear. His name hadn't been spoken since. Until now. He took the rosary to Maddox. Maddox went pale. "Where did you get this?" "The confessional." Maddox didn't blink. "Who put it there?" "I don't know," Father Brown said, "but I heard him not say it." They examined the engraving. It wasn't recent. The oxidation suggested months. But it hadn't been there before, not when Blake died, which meant someone had kept it, hidden it, carried it, until now. "Why return it?" Maddox muttered. "Why now?" The next day, the church was vandalized. Not broken, not robbed. Red paint, letters smeared across the front doors. "Do not forgive what you don't know." No one saw who did it. No one heard. But the priest from the next parish over sent a message to Father Brown. He had a visitor the previous evening. A man, nervous, asked to light a candle, left quickly, didn't give a name, but left behind a jacket. In the jacket's pocket, another note. She always saw, no signature. Father Brown returned to the church archives, dug through the funeral records, the confession logs, the letters the bishop never answered. He wasn't looking for who had come. He was looking for who had disappeared. He found her name, buried between 2 sermons. A woman named Ruth Marlin. Organist, 42, quiet, sharp-eyed, known to be observant, known to be discreet. She had gone missing the night Blake died. Everyone assumed she'd left the village. A note had been found in her cottage. "I need silence." But the note, Father Brown now realized, had never been authenticated. He visited her house, abandoned, dust-covered, but one window had been freshly cleaned. A pane of glass, polished clear, surrounded by smudged fingerprints, and on the sill, an indentation, like someone had placed something there, something like a candle. Back at the church, he found the matching mark on the inside of the confessional. Someone had mirrored the setup. 2 candles, 2 rooms, 1 moment. She saw something, or someone, and she hadn't left. She had been silenced. Maddox reopened the case. They questioned everyone again. One by one, villagers offered half-memories. The vicar remembered Ruth leaving early. The baker recalled her not buying her usual loaf. The housekeeper at the manor claimed she saw Ruth heading toward the chapel after hours. All fragments, all lies wrapped in politeness. Then one boy, young, no, older than 12, confessed to something small. "I saw someone go into the church after dark. I was hiding, playing. I thought it was Ruth, but it wasn't. He walked differently." "How so?" Father Brown asked. "He limped. Just a little. That was all. But it was enough. There was only one man in the village who limped in that precise way. the undertaker's son, Philip Crane, quiet, pale, always present at the back of every funeral, but never in any photos. He hadn't spoken to Ruth. No one remembered them talking. But when Father Brown visited the funeral home under pretense of arranging a ceremony, Philip wasn't there and hadn't been seen since the vandalism. The chapel was watched for 3 nights. On the 4th, a shadow entered. Thin, careful. Philip. He went straight to the confessional, knelt, said nothing, then placed something small beneath the seat and stood. Father Brown stepped from the shadows. Philip didn't flinch. "You know I can't absolve what isn't said, Father," Brown said gently. Philip looked up. "I wasn't going to ask. What did she see?" Philip blinked. "Everything." And then he ran. By the time Maddox arrived, Philip was gone. But beneath the seat, in the small hiding space, they found what he had left, a photograph. Ruth Marlin standing in the church, hands clasped. Behind her, barely visible, a man. Face turned, unclear, but he wore a priest's collar, and the rosary in his hand matched the one Edmund Blake had carried. There had never been just one sin. There had been 2, and only one man had confessed. The other had hidden it, not in a scream, but in silence, in the place meant for truth. And now that silence was breaking. The next day, the chapel doors were found open. A new note lay on the altar. Not all confessions are heard. Some are buried alive. Father Brown folded the note slowly, whispered to no one in particular, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. Father Brown read her eyes. She said she didn't know who killed her sister, but her eyes flinched when no one asked if she'd watched her die. The girl walked into the chapel just after Vespers, shoulders trembling beneath a pale green coat too thin for the early autumn chill. Her name was Julia Wexley, and her arrival would have gone unnoticed by most had she not stepped so deliberately into the pew where her sister had sat every Sunday until the night her body was found in the pond, behind the rectory. Drowned, they said. A tragic accident. Her boots were muddy, her fingers raw, but no signs of struggle. The town accepted it as misfortune, but Father Brown didn't believe in convenient deaths, and he never trusted silence from people who had nothing left to lose. Julia didn't speak when she entered. She sat quietly, folding her hands like a child forced to recite grace. Her eyes flicked to the altar, to the stained glass image of St. Michael slaying the dragon, then down to the place on the floor where her sister's memorial bouquet still wilted. Father Brown watched from the rear pew, unmoving. He'd spoken to her once, days ago, when she returned from the sanitarium. She said she had no memory of what happened the night Evelyn drowned. The doctors agreed. Trauma, they said. Shock. The kind of thing the mind protects itself from by shutting the door and throwing away the key. But Father Brown saw the lie even then. Not in her words, but in her eyes. She had known what happened, and she was terrified someone else would figure it out. That night, the candle by the altar flickered strangely. No windows open, no breeze, just that flame, shivering like it was afraid to be the only thing left awake. Julia remained in the pew long after the doors should have closed. When Father Brown approached, she flinched, as though he'd caught her in the act of remembering. He sat beside her, said nothing. Minutes passed before she finally whispered, "I dreamed of her again." "Did she speak?" he asked. "No." "What did she do?" Julia's hands tightened. "She pointed." "Where?" Julia didn't answer. She stood and left. The next morning, the old gardener reported something strange behind the rectory. A broken mirror had been propped against the back of the tool shed. No one had seen it before. The glass was cracked in the center, but still intact enough to reflect a warped image of the chapel's rear wall. Etched into the bottom of the glass, barely visible in the morning light, were 4 words. She looked back twice. Father Brown didn't understand at first, but he remembered what Maddox had said weeks ago when the body was found. Evelyn was discovered with her face turned, not downward in submission, but twisted backward, as if she had tried to look behind her before the water filled her lungs. Twice? Who looks back twice unless someone is chasing them? He questioned Julia again. This time, she didn't come to the church. She sent a letter. It read, "Stop asking, I already told you what I can't remember." But the handwriting betrayed her. It trembled in places the original note, left after her sister's death, had not. Fear doesn't fake its own signature. Father Brown dug deeper, into the sisters' history, into the gossip around the Wexley family. Their father had died when they were young. Their mother had vanished shortly after. Raised by an aunt with strict ideas about decency and punishment, Evelyn was the golden child, the obedient one. Julia was not. Maddox dismissed it as sibling jealousy. Maybe she envied her. Maybe she hated her. But hate isn't a crime. Not on paper, Father Brown replied, but in the eyes, it's a confession. That night, someone broke into the chapel. Nothing was taken, but something was left behind. A scarf. Evelyn's, folded neatly over the front pew, and pinned to it a single brass key, not to a house, not to a diary, but to the old bell tower that had been sealed for years. Father Brown climbed the tower. At dawn, the staircase groaning beneath him like it hadn't held a secret in decades. At the top, hidden behind the old organ pipes, he found a small wooden box. Inside, a photograph, Evelyn and Julia, standing in front of a mirror. But only one reflection showed both sisters. The other, Evelyn, appeared alone in the glass. Julia's reflection was missing. Father Brown stared at the photo for a long time, then turned it over, scrawled in graphite, "You can't reflect what's already gone." That afternoon, Father Brown confronted Julia on the chapel steps. She was pale, her coat even thinner than before. "I know what Evelyn did," he said softly. Julia's eyes welled instantly, not with guilt, but something worse. Relief. "She said she'd tell," Julia whispered. "Said she'd ruin everything. Said it didn't matter what I remembered, because she did." Father Brown waited. "I didn't mean for her to fall," she continued. "I only followed her. She ran. I called her name. She turned. Once. Then, again. And then she was gone." He asked if she pushed her. She shook her head. But he saw the flicker in her pupils, the tiniest, sharpest flinch. "No," she said. But her eyes screamed yes. Maddox wanted to arrest her, said the confession was enough, said trauma couldn't hide forever. But Father Brown said no, because the truth wasn't that Julia killed her sister. It was that Evelyn had made Julia believe she had, manipulated her, punished her, until even Julia's memories belonged to Evelyn. That night, Father Brown lit a candle in the chapel and sat by the mirror in the back hallway, the one Evelyn used to check her hair before choir practice. He watched it for hours. At midnight, the candle dimmed, and in the mirror, for the briefest moment, he saw 2 girls, one standing still, the other looking back. Twice. He didn't look away, didn't blink. When the image faded, Father Brown whispered into the silence, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. The prayer she never finished. She died before she reached Amen. And someone made sure her last word was never heard. The moment the church doors swung open and the rain spilled in, Father Brown knew something was terribly wrong. The altar candles had burned too low. The air smelled of iron and something sour. And on the cold stone floor, just below the pulpit, knelt Miss Isabella Crane, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, her eyes wide open, and her lips frozen mid-word. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't unconscious. She was dead. And yet her body was still upright, as if death had interrupted her, not with violence, but with purpose. Isabella had been a fixture in the chapel since she was a girl, never missed a mass, always took the third pew from the front, said the rosary twice a day, once for herself and once for someone she never named. She lived alone after her brother died in the war, and the only thing louder than her absence in the village was her presence in prayer. So when she didn't answer the baker's knock that morning, or collect her milk from the doorstep, they knew where she'd be. In the church, as always. But this time, she wasn't kneeling in devotion. She was caught in the middle of something that no one else could see, something that stopped her breath halfway through a whisper. Maddox was called, of course. He circled the scene, muttering about heart failure and stress. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything unnatural had occurred. But Father Brown stared at her fingers. They were locked together in a clasped prayer, but the fingernails of one hand were bleeding slightly, as if she'd dug them into her own skin. Not from fear, from restraint, and beneath her body, tucked between the cold stone and her skirts, was a single torn scrap of parchment. Not a prayer, not a psalm, just 4 faint words. "Forgive me for seeing." The question wasn't how she died. The question was why she died in that moment, during prayer, in the safest place in the village, with a message meant for no one, or maybe meant for everyone. The chapel's doors were locked at night, but Isabella had a key. Everyone knew that. What no one could explain was why someone had tried to hide that she'd been there at all. The footprints outside the back door had been swept poorly. A few strands of her shawl were stuffed behind a hymnal in the 4th pew, not the 3rd, where she always sat, and the confession booth door was left slightly ajar, though it hadn't been used in days. Father Brown found something else. On the altar rail, etched so lightly into the wood it could only be seen in the right light, were 3 dates. The first, 2 years ago. The second, 5 months ago. The third, last night. All 3, he realized, corresponded to sudden disappearances in the village. A shopkeeper's wife who left in the middle of the night. A boy who vanished after choir practice. A visiting priest who never returned to his parish, all declared unrelated, all forgotten in time, except by Isabella. She had seen something. She had written it down, and now that record was gone. Father Brown searched her cottage. It was neat, unnaturally so, drawers closed too perfectly, books aligned without dust, a Bible on the nightstand, but one page missing from the middle. Psalms. The exact psalm Isabella used to recite every Sunday without fail. When he pulled back the carpet beneath her bed, he found a hatch in the floor. Inside, nothing. Nothing but a single envelope, unmarked, and inside that, a name. A name Father Brown had not heard in 10 years. The name of the girl who had disappeared after confessing that someone followed her home from choir. The name of the visiting priest, who had been reassigned the next day. The name that should have been forgotten, but wasn't. Father Brown returned to the church. He entered the confession booth. He sat in the priest's side, closed the curtain, and waited. Not for a voice, for a sound. And he heard it. A click. Not from the door, from inside the wall. He pressed his hand against the panel, and it gave. A hollow space. A box. Inside, another letter, written in a shaky hand, dated 2 days ago. Isabella's handwriting. If I don't finish my prayer, it's because he was listening. The one in the other booth, the one who never left, the one who isn't a priest anymore. Maddox said it wasn't enough, said it was paranoia, grief. But Father Brown knew better. He returned that night, alone. He entered the booth again, waited again, and this time he smelled smoke, not fire, candle wax, fresh. There was someone on the other side, breathing, listening, and then a knock, 3 slow taps on the wooden wall, and a voice, faint, as if it came from deep within the walls themselves. She should not have watched. Father Brown didn't answer. He stood, opened the curtain. The other booth was empty, but the faint warmth of breath still lingered in the air. The next morning, another woman was missing. The baker's daughter, last seen lighting a candle for Isabella. Her scarf was found in the front pew, with a rosary wrapped too tightly around it, like a warning or a curse. The priest from the next parish came to bless the chapel, said the air was wrong, said the shadows moved where light should be. But Father Brown stayed, sat in Isabella's pew, read from her Bible, and stared at the place where her final word had been swallowed. Amen. A word she never reached, because someone didn't want her prayer to end. Someone feared what she might say next. Maddox wanted to close the case, called it heart failure, exhaustion. But Father Brown just stared at the booth and whispered into the silence, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 9. A whisper changed everything, forever. He leaned in to confess his sins, but what he whispered instead made Father Brown stop breathing. It happened just before the chapel closed. The light through the stained glass windows had faded to a murky violet, and the only sound was the wind pressing against the old wooden door like it was trying to get inside. Father Brown was gathering the prayer books when the man entered. Unassuming, mid-30s, a coat too thin for the season, a face that wouldn't draw attention in a crowd, but eyes that hadn't slept properly in weeks. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded, knelt, and asked, barely above a whisper, if the confessional was open. Father Brown obliged. He entered the booth, expecting guilt, expecting grief. But instead, what came through the screen was something else entirely. It wasn't a confession. It was a name. And the name he whispered was supposed to be dead. It wasn't the name itself that stopped Father Brown cold. It was the context, the way he said it, the precise, deliberate tone, not a slip of the tongue or a trick of memory. He said it like it was still alive, like it was still watching. The name, Clara Holloway, hadn't been spoken aloud in months. Not since her body was allegedly recovered from the marsh outside Kembleford. Not since the funeral with the closed casket. Not since the village collectively agreed to forget the details because they were too tangled to look at directly. But here it was, again, spoken in a whisper so soft it scraped the soul. Father Brown didn't respond right away. He didn't have to, because the man kept talking. She told me, the man whispered, that if I said anything, they'd bury me next. Who they were, he didn't explain, but his voice cracked like he was being followed, like he wasn't just afraid, he was already mourning his own disappearance. He didn't give an address. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said the words, like he needed someone else to carry them. And then he left. No signature, no penance. Father Brown emerged from the confessional and ran to the door, but the man was already gone. The village square was empty. Not even footsteps in the dirt, just silence, and a whisper that now echoed louder than a scream. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he revisited every detail of Clara's case. Every report, every statement, every photograph. Especially the photograph taken just before the funeral, when the casket was delivered from the morgue. The casket that no one opened. The casket that the medical examiner had certified based on dental records alone. But Father Brown remembered something. Clara had a chipped front tooth, a childhood fall. It had always made her smile lopsided. The body in the report had no such mark, which meant the body in the box wasn't Clara, which meant Clara never died, which meant everything the village believed was a lie, and someone wanted it to stay that way. He took the files to Maddox. The inspector was skeptical at first, until he saw the autopsy photo side by side with Clara's school picture. Then he paled. Not because the match was wrong, but because it was too clean, too perfect, like someone had altered the photograph to match a narrative already written. "This isn't just mice identification," Maddox muttered. "This is staging." Father Brown nodded, and someone went to great lengths to make sure she was declared dead. They tracked the records back to the morgue in Brighton. The body had been transferred in a sealed case, paperwork signed by a single witness, a name neither of them recognized, James Alton. But the signature was in Clara's handwriting. Maddox didn't believe it at first. Why would she forge her own death certificate? To escape something worse, Father Brown replied. That afternoon, the chapel received a delivery. No return address, just a small parcel wrapped in old newspaper. Inside, a cassette tape and a note. "Play this before you bury the truth again." Father Brown borrowed the constable's recorder and pressed play. The audio was faint, distant, but two voices emerged. One was Clara's, the other was a man begging her not to tell, begging her to forget what she saw in the tower, begging her not to speak the name. She didn't respond, but she didn't have to, because in the background of the recording, a third voice whispered one word, a name, and that name was Father Brown's. The tape clicked off. Maddox looked at him in disbelief. "Someone's trying to make this about you." But Father Brown wasn't so sure, because he recognized the third voice. It was the same man from the confession booth, the man who claimed to be running, the man who had whispered Clara's name like it was still alive. They tracked the shipping address to a post office box on the edge of town, registered under a fake name. But the clerk remembered the man. Tall, nervous, smelled of candle smoke, and he left behind a scrap of paper on the counter. "Oh, handwritten note. One of them isn't buried." That night, Father Brown returned to the cemetery. He visited Clara's grave. Kneeling, he noticed something strange. The soil was fresh, not recently dug, but recently disturbed. The nameplate on the headstone was clean, too clean. He brushed it with his sleeve, and the name smudged. Beneath the paint was a different engraving, a different name. Evelyn Wexley, another girl who had disappeared, another girl whose body had never been truly confirmed. Clara was never buried. Evelyn was. and someone had swapped the names to hide both. Father Brown dug deeper into the church records. He found inconsistencies in the baptism logs, wedding notices that listed names no one remembered, confession schedules filled with blanks, and at the heart of it all, a recurring symbol, a rose drawn in the corner of each page, small, delicate, but identical. Clara's symbol, the one she carved into her desk as a girl, the one she wore on a pendant that was never found after her death. And then, just before dawn, a new note appeared on the chapel door. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper, pinned with a knife. You heard the whisper. But do you know what she said next? The ink was smudged, as if written in a storm. But beneath it, barely visible in the corner, was a thumbprint. Burned, charred, not ink, but ash. Maddox wanted to evacuate the church, said someone was trying to stage a scene. But Father Brown knew better. Someone wasn't staging anything. Someone was inviting the truth out of hiding. A whisper had changed everything, and whatever was said next could burn the whole village down. He stared at the confessional and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. He feared Father Brown. Listening, he set the church on fire because he was too afraid Father Brown might overhear what he was about to confess. The blaze was quick, brutal, and too precise to be random. It began in the confessional booth, the one on the left, where secrets were whispered and sins were meant to die in silence. The fire gutted only that section of the chapel, not the altar, not the pews, not even the hymnals, just the confessional, and just the booth where the penitent speaks. The priest's side, the listening side, was untouched, as if someone wanted to erase their words, but couldn't quite bring themselves to silence the man who might hear them. It was midnight when the fire brigade arrived, too late to stop the smoldering ruin. The chapel was empty, or so they thought, but when the smoke cleared, they found something strange in the ashes. A pocket watch, still ticking, buried under the floorboard just beneath the booth. And inside the back of the watch was a tiny scrap of paper, rolled tight, sealed with wax. Father Brown was the one who recognized it. He had seen that exact pocket watch before, 10 years ago, when it belonged to Elias Hartley, the former town treasurer who vanished after being accused of embezzlement. Everyone believed he drowned himself in the river after the scandal. No body was ever found, no goodbye letter, no burial, just guilt and rumor and a silence no one could penetrate. The watch had vanished with him, and now here it was, still warm from the flames, still ticking, and inside the scroll of paper, a single sentence in cramped, panicked handwriting. If he hears it, it becomes real. Maddox dismissed it as lunacy. The man was probably mad, he said, shaking his head. We've got half the village hiding from their own ghosts these days. But Father Brown didn't agree, because madness doesn't burn a confessional to the ground and leave behind a warning. Madness doesn't run from silence. Fear does, and fear is always hiding something true. Father Brown began retracing the old case, the Hartley embezzlement. He visited the old town archives, pulled the original audit, studied the signatures, but something struck him immediately. The handwriting on the scroll from the pocket watch didn't match Elias Hartley's hand from 10 years ago. It matched someone else's, a clerk, a man named Peter Linwood, Hartley's assistant, the man who claimed to have found the falsified ledgers, the man who had publicly testified against Hartley before the town council, the man who had been promoted to treasurer after the scandal. Father Brown paid Peter a visit. He lived alone in the cottage behind the railway station, rarely seen except on market days. When Father Brown knocked, the door opened slowly, as if it had been expecting something other than a priest. Peter looked older than his age, brittle skin, sunken eyes, the kind of expression that flinched even when there was no sound. "I won't go to confession," he said, before Father Brown could speak. "Not again." Father Brown nodded. "Then just talk." Peter didn't answer, but his hands shook, and when he turned to let the priest in, Father Brown noticed something tucked beneath the bookshelf, a burned scrap of wood. It was carved with two initials, E. H. Elias Hartley. Peter followed his gaze. "I didn't mean to keep it. I meant to destroy everything." "Why?" Father Brown asked gently. Peter didn't sit. He hovered, like the truth inside him had become too large to rest. "He came back," Peter whispered. "Elias?" Peter nodded. 2 weeks ago, just after Vespers. He was thinner, older. But it was him. I'd know his voice anywhere." "What did he say?" Peter looked away. "He didn't say anything." "Then how do you know?" "He didn't have to say it," Peter said, louder now. "He just stood there, in the pew, watching me, like he knew I'd lied, like he knew I'd sent him away, with everyone's sin on his back." Father Brown stayed silent. "He asked to go to confession," Peter said, voice cracking. "I told him you weren't there, that the church was closed. He said he'd wait." "And did he?" Peter shook his head. "He never came back. That night," Peter claimed, "he found a letter on his doorstep. No envelope, just a piece of parchment soaked in rain and ash. One line. 'You buried me.' Now dig." Peter hadn't slept since. And then, the fire. Father Brown returned to the church ruins. In the rubble near the booth, he found a nail, a long, thin spike, cleaner than the others. It had been placed, not fallen. And wedged beneath it, buried in a crack between the floorboards, was a gold ring. Not recent, worn smooth on one side. The engraving inside was faded, but still legible. "To E. H. Justice Always, a retirement gift." Father Brown remembered the inscription. It had been mentioned once at the town council's farewell address. Hartley was a meticulous man, a servant of order, and yet he vanished without a trace, until now. That evening, the gravekeeper reported something else. One of the graves had been disturbed, not dug up, but tampered with. A stone had been shifted. The name on the grave, Elias Hartley, but there was no coffin beneath, no bones, just stones, a dummy burial, a name carved to satisfy curiosity, a body never placed. Father Brown called Maddox, demanded the truth, but Maddox admitted he had never seen the body, that the coroner had signed off with a forged certificate, handed in by a council official, long since retired. The whole thing had been arranged, and the only person who had ever known that for sure was Peter. Until Elias came back. Maddox argued it was a setup, that someone wanted revenge, that someone had used the legend of Elias Hartley to sow chaos. But Father Brown remembered Peter's final words before he vanished. He said, "I should tell you, that if you listened, the lie would end." Peter was found 2 days later, not dead, just gone. He'd boarded a train south with no bags, no ticket, no destination, just a burned photograph in his coat pocket, a photo of himself, 10 years younger, standing beside Hartley, smiling, but in the reflection behind them, in the window glass, a shadow watched. Not Hartley, not Peter, someone else, a third figure, the same face that had been reported outside the church days before the fire, the same man now rumored to be staying in the old vicar's cottage at the edge of town, the one no one remembered renting, the one no one dared visit. Father Brown stood in the middle of the blackened chapel, ash in his hands, the charred remains of a truth no one wanted to hear, smouldering beneath his feet. And he whispered into the dark, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. The cross fell too quietly. The heavy oak cross above the altar crashed to the floor at midnight, but made no sound. The candles were still burning when it happened. The chapel was empty, silent, still. As it always was during the hour, Father Brown called the soul's breath. That moment just after midnight, when the village slept and sins crept out of the shadows to be alone with themselves. He had come to pray, not out of ritual, but out of unease. Something had been wrong all week, not just with the church, but with the people. Eyes darted more. Footsteps halted mid-stride. Doors locked too quickly. And no one, absolutely no one, had sat in the front pew since the choir girl was buried. Father Brown knelt with his head bowed, and in that cold silence, he felt it rather than heard it. The air shifted. The candles flickered in unison, not from a gust, but from something deeper, something interior. Then the cross fell. A massive thing, thick-beamed, hanging above the altar by a wrought iron chain for over 100 years. It dropped, struck the stone tiles, and made no noise. Not a creak, not a crack, not even a breath. Just the unbearable stillness of something divine, unhooked from its rightful place. He stood, stunned, and approached the wreckage. The cross lay intact, which was impossible. The marble tiles beneath had not even chipped. Only one thing was different. Carved into the back of the cross, in tiny scratches too shallow to see from a distance, were 6 words. "Forgive me, I buried the wrong one." The handwriting was shaky, not chiseled, not part of the wood's natural grain. Deliberate, recently made. Father Brown didn't call the constable immediately. He sat beside the fallen cross and waited. The next morning, the gravekeeper reported something even stranger. One of the headstones had changed. Not been replaced, changed. The name engraved into the limestone was now someone who was supposed to still be alive. Margaret Elwood. The village midwife, elderly, kind, always seen with her cane and her wide-brimmed hat. Still seen, in fact, just yesterday. But there it was, her name, her full name, with the date of death listed as last Sunday, the same day the choir girl had been buried, the same service Margaret had skipped, despite always attending them without fail. Maddox was called. He paid Margaret a visit. She answered the door, smiling, warm, but different. She offered tea. She offered a seat. She didn't mention the grave. And when Father Brown arrived and asked directly about it, she only blinked. "Must be some mistake," she said softly. "I'm right here after all." But when she turned to fetch more biscuits, Father Brown stepped into the hallway, and there he saw it. A pair of boots by the coat rack, boots too large to be hers, boots caked with the red clay of the churchyard. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. He examined the chain that had held the cross. It wasn't rusted, it wasn't broken. It had been unscrewed, cleanly, deliberately, by someone who had stood on the altar and made sure it would fall, without touching a soul. He checked the guest book. No unusual visitors. But on the last page, someone had written a single phrase and crossed it out. Not fully, just faintly enough that it was still legible. "I thought it was her." He returned to the graveyard before dawn, found Margaret Elwood's tomb again, and dug. Maddox protested, but Father Brown insisted. The casket was there, but it wasn't Margaret inside. It was the choir girl, wearing Margaret's hat, Margaret's clothes, Margaret's wedding ring. But not Margaret. The body had been misidentified, buried under the wrong name, and someone, likely the real Margaret, was alive, pretending not to be. When they returned to her cottage, she was gone. No sign of a struggle, no signs of a pack, just one item left behind on her dining table, her cane, and underneath it, pressed into the wood of the table, a faint circle where a cup of tea had rested, still warm. They searched the village. No trace. Only one person claimed to see her, the baker's son. Said she passed him in the lane just before morning. She smiled, but she didn't have a reflection in the puddle she stepped over. That night, a new cross was raised, but it didn't stay up for long. At precisely midnight, it trembled and tipped forward. Father Brown caught it before it fell, but not before he saw what had been carved into the wood again. Fresh, in a different hand, "You buried the innocent, you left the watcher." He turned, but no one was there, just the empty church and the sound of footsteps walking away through the stone floor. Except there were no footsteps, only echoes. And the echo didn't belong to him. Father Brown stood in the dark, let the silence close in, then whispered to the candles, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. Her shadow didn't follow her. She stepped into the sunlight at precisely noon, but there was nothing behind her, not even a shadow. It happened in front of half the village. The market was just closing, the bell had struck 12, and the light was sharp, direct, merciless. Everyone turned to see her. Eleanor Merton, the girl who was supposed to have drowned in the quarry 6 months ago, standing in the square like she'd never left, wearing the same crimson coat she had last been seen in, her hair tied with the same black ribbon, her face pale but alive. But it wasn't her reappearance that silenced the villagers. It was the fact that she cast no shadow. The sun was high. The stones of the square were patterned with the silhouettes of chimneys, carts, awnings, cats, children, everything and everyone. Except her. She didn't run, she didn't speak, she simply walked toward the church, and her shadow didn't follow her. Father Brown had just finished morning prayers when he heard the murmurs, half fear, half disbelief. He stepped out onto the chapel steps and saw her at once. She hadn't aged, she didn't look sick, she didn't even look real. Her eyes were glassy, focused on something behind him, not around her. And her steps made no sound, even on the loose gravel path. He felt it in his spine before she even crossed the threshold. This wasn't resurrection. This was a reckoning. Elena had vanished the day after confessing something she never got the chance to finish. She'd come to Father Brown trembling, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking, saying only, "I saw it happen, but I wasn't supposed to." Before she could say more, someone knocked on the chapel door. She'd flinched, apologized, fled, and was never seen again. Until now. Maddox had led the investigation, of course. They found her bicycle near the quarry, her coat torn at the sleeve, her diary soaked in mud and pinned shut with a stone, as though someone had meant to weigh her secrets down permanently. No body, no trail. Just emptiness. The town grieved. Quietly, uneasily. But now, here she was, walking into the church like nothing had changed. And the air inside went cold the moment she crossed the threshold. Father Brown stepped down from the altar. The congregation sat frozen in their pews, unsure whether to breathe or bolt. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you've come home." But she didn't reply. She walked to the front pew, knelt, and began to pray. Only her lips didn't move, and there was no sound, no breath, no whisper, only stillness. Father Brown stepped closer. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded, but her pulse, when he gently touched her wrist, was gone. Maddox stormed in moments later, demanded answers, demanded explanations. Father Brown said nothing until he looked down and saw something etched into the wood of the pew beneath her hands, scratched in jagged lines as though carved with a fingernail. "I never left." He did that night. Elena's body was taken to the infirmary. The doctor confirmed she was dead. Not recently, for weeks, at least. The villagers fell silent again, terrified, because everyone had seen her walk, everyone had seen her arrive, everyone had seen the coat, the hair, the girl, but no one had seen the shadow. Maddox called for the records. He pulled the old diary from the evidence box. He found something no one had noticed before. The last entry, barely legible in smudged ink. "If I disappear, find the man with no reflection." No signature, just a drawing, a mirror, cracked. That same evening, the chapel candles lit themselves. No one was inside, no matches, no wind, just flames, dancing without smoke. Father Brown walked the perimeter of the church. In the grass beneath the eastern window, he found footprints, one set in, none coming out, and in the dirt, a silver chain, her necklace, clasp unbroken. He stared at the chapel, at the window, at the empty space beside him on the ground, where no shadow should have fallen, but did. Not his, own someone else's, watching. That's when he remembered. 6 months ago, the man who had knocked on the chapel door the moment Elena tried to confess. Tall, well-dressed, familiar but forgettable. He'd said he was looking for sanctuary, but he never came back. And the visitor's log, Father Brown checked it now, had no name listed for that evening. Because Father Brown had never written it down, because something about him had made Father Brown forget. But now he remembered. The man had stood in the sun for over 5 minutes outside the church and hadn't cast a shadow either. The next day, the church bell rang 12 times. No one pulled the rope. No one was inside. But a book fell from the pulpit. Elena's diary, opened to the middle, a page that hadn't been there before, written in her handwriting, but the ink was still wet. He walks in light, but he doesn't carry it. Maddox refused to open the case again. Said the body was found, said the girl had died, said the rest was hysteria. But that night, his shadow didn't match his footsteps, and Father Brown saw it and said nothing. He returned to the chapel, sat in the pew where Eleanor had knelt, and whispered to the darkness behind him, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told."